The first decade of the new millennium saw a number of white British female singers find success with albums clearly inspired by a uniquely contemporary blend of sounds derived from soul, jazz, funk, blues, Motown, and to some extent hip-hop, and the critical reception of the artists in question framed them both explicitly and implicitly as drawing on an African-American musical lineage. Amy Winehouse's jazz-inspired Frank in 2003 went critically unnoticed, but Joss Stone's The Soul Sessions in 2004 paved the way for Winehouse to return with Back to Black in 2006, and this became the second best-selling album of the 21st century. Duffy's Rock Ferry and Adele's 19 both landed in 2008, and Paloma Faith continued the trend with Do You Want the Truth or Something Beautiful the following year. In one way or another, all of them were tied by critics into a narrative of genre that located their roots in historical, particularly 1960s, American popular culture, and especially that as represented by African American women. In the cases of Duffy and Winehouse particularly, critics would often point to a particular girl group sound that summons up images of the Ronettes, the Shirelles and the Supremes, and beyond that to an even more generic Motown or soul sound. The sonic comparisons are easy to find. So for example, if we start with something like Wake Up Alone by Amy Winehouse, we find a generic trope that we can also trace to something like For Your Precious Love by The Impressions. And it's a trope that's also picked up by Paloma Faith in My Legs Are Weak. Or if we take a look at Tears Dry on Their Own, also by Winehouse.
All I can ever be to you is the darkness that we know and this regret I got accustomed to. Once you walked the ride when we were at our height, waiting for you in the hotel at night.
Then we can find some pretty clear traces of Ain't No Mountain High Enough by Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell. Or as another example, Duffy's Stepping Stone. Is more or less identical in many ways to Walk On By Dionne Warwick. And likewise, and in case anybody was in any remaining doubt about the similarities here, we have Hanging On Too Long, also by Duffy.
It was just my...
And that bears more than a passing resemblance to Heard It Through the Grapevine by Marvin Gaye, including to the level of the rhythmic entry of the vocals. Vocally, a few names appear most frequently in the discourse around all of these artists, as their voices are palpably indebted to those of Aretha Franklin, Etta James, Diana Ross and Sarah Vaughan and many others besides, and indeed the artists themselves frequently cite these voices as inspiration. Not only in the journalistic discourse but also in the scholarship, the implication and sometimes the explicit accusation is that these artists are engaged in an act of cultural appropriation, the latest culprits in a long history of white artists deploying black sound worlds for their own gain. Daphne Brooks, for instance, describes this wave of British white female soul singers as the most seductive female minstrel show since Sophie Tucker sang the St. Louis Blues, thus pointing to a long and complex history of blackface. The arrangement, timbre, instrumentation and production styles of these recordings do indeed sonically evoke bygone eras. and the singers certainly deploy various vocal strategies that appear to enact a specific set of vocal choreographies, as Nina Eidshine would call it, that signify blackness. But I want to contend that something else is also at play here. In particular, I want to explore the relevance of other racialized and gendered histories and strategies of nostalgia in the musical sounds and cultures being drawn on. Ultimately, I seek to reveal a particular multicultural Londonness in the music of those artists raised in London, notably Winehouse and Adele. Daphne Brooks argues that Winehouse embodies a new millennial blackface spectacle, and that her technologies of cultural memory are predicated upon specifically drawing from and yet effacing the work of black female artists. Moreover, that she sounds the grain of black womanhood moving through their aesthetic forms in order to shore up her own subjectivity. Likewise, Amanda Edgar describes Adele's voice as that of a white singer performing black vocal sounds, or what has been termed by Kana in 2008 as black voice. So I want to go deeper into this narrative, and indeed beyond it, to uncover the additional roles of post-millenniality, Britishness and multiculturalism in these sound worlds, with a view to uncovering a somewhat more complex, nostalgic agenda than terms like blackface or black voice would suggest. So there are two key elements to my argument. Number one, as much as the sounds from which these artists draw point most clearly to an African American musical history, they do not owe their distinctiveness solely to that history. Number two, if, as Edgar and Brooks do, we are to talk about the grain of these artists' voices, there are in fact audible ways in which their grains point not only to black, by implication African American womanhood, but also to a multicultural London history. So here's part one. What Daphne Brooks' explanation of the Winehouse phenomenon reveals is a larger trope, one that can be framed in terms of what Jennifer Stover calls the listening ear and the sonic colour line. Asking the question, what is the relationship between sonic and visual regimes, Stover explains. The sonic colour line describes the process of racializing sound, how and why certain bodies are expected to produce, desire and live amongst particular sounds, and its product, the hierarchical division sounded between whiteness and blackness. The listening ear drives the sonic colour line. It is a figure for how dominant listening practices accrue and change over time, as well as a descriptor for how the dominant culture exerts pressure on individual listening practices to conform to the sonic colour line's norms. Certainly, this post-millennial sonic nostalgia has been racialized, but the sonic colour line operates along a binary hierarchy between black and white, and the listening ear is only crudely selective for its evidence, as it seeks to locate sounds in relation to this two-poled axis. The potential for facing in two directions at once is hard to find, and yet these artists do just that. The specific factor I want to draw attention to first in the history of the so-called African American sound is that of the Jewish influence on American popular music in the mid-20th century. Specifically, there are three sonic features that post-millennial, white, British, so-called neo-soul artists are linked to that are typically used as markers of black influence, yet were also strongly influenced by Jewish Americans. Number one, songwriting. Number two, production. And number three, vocal staging. Here I draw significantly on the work of John Stratton, and in particular his book Jews, Race and Popular Music, 2009. Time prevents a close exploration of all of these elements, although as something of a hint towards the first two, I should name-check the Brill Building, populated significantly by Jewish songwriters such as Lieber and Stoller, Neil Diamond, Neil Sedaka, Jerry Goffin, Carole King, Burt Bacharach, and many more. The Brill Building produced a good chunk of the canon of the repertoire under consideration. I should also name-check Phil Spector in particular, who not only wrote a number of songs, but more significantly, perhaps, developed the famous wall of sound production technique, traces of which can be easily found in post-millennial white soul. It is the third of these issues, that of vocal staging, which is most significant for my purposes here, and it has to do with the expression of emotionality. Amanda Edgar argues, citing Deborah Walker King, that rock and roll grew around an unharnessed vocal emotion born from the culture of diasporic pain in American black musical culture. And Edgar uses this to explain the blackness of Adele's vocal sound. But as John Stratton argues, the so-called blackness of unharnessed vocal emotion may have a significant root in Jewish musical culture. Tracing the Jewish contribution to torch singing, Stratton identifies the vocal strategies of Sophie Tucker and Libby Holman in particular to a style on which I would argue Adele clearly draws. Certainly, the ghosts of African American voices can also be heard in Adele's vocal choreographies, but at the very least they are intermingled with, and possibly quite separate from, those of Jewish voices such as Tucker and Holman. As Pamela Lavitt describes, Tucker in particular developed an older appropriative practice of coon shouting into a modern invention, contributing significantly to a new style of vocal staging that frames emotion as unharnessed. In Tucker's vocal style particularly, I think we can hear the forerunners of Adele's, a speech-like flexibility of rhythm, the use of sudden dynamic changes, and the juxtaposition of upper-range belting with a soft vibrato, all of which combine to construct emotional authenticity. We can trace these strategies of emotional expression not only through African American vocal culture, but also through a Jewish vocal history that weaves Tucker and Holman together with Barbra Streisand and Georgia Brown, whose creation of the role of Nancy in the 1964 musical Oliver signified the start of the belted finale as a musical theatre convention. And this tradition moves on to the big-voiced vocal divas of the later 20th century, some Jewish like Idina Menzel, and others not, like Celine Dion. Stratton and others have explored the intertwining relationship between Jewish entertainers and blackface in the early part of the 20th century, pointing to Al Jolson, Eddie Cantor, Fanny Brice and Sophie Tucker as examples of the phenomenon. As Michael Rogan notes, Jews had almost entirely taken over blackface entertainment by the early 20th century. Resting on the discursive construct of a shared suffering, blackface could be taken as expressing Jewish solidarity with another pariah group. Importantly, this discourse of shared pain was part of a broader blurring of distinction between African American and Jewish bodies at the level of cultural function, such that Jews and blacks were conflated under an Orientalist umbrella based on a common set of racial stereotypes. In short, Jews have not consistently been read as white. Indeed, blackface would prove to be not simply the expression of woe from a position of shared otherness, but as a strategy for whitening, since, as Rogan puts it, blackface may not seem to express Jewishness at all, but to hide it. And in hiding Jewishness, whiteness becomes the remainder. What we can take from all of this is, in short, that the sound of blackness in these post-millennial white voices is by no means specifically the sound of African Americanness. Rather, the racial ambiguity of Jews in early 20th century American culture explains both their early connection with African American musical culture, during an early period when they were explained in terms of blackness, and also the later perception of their contribution as appropriative from a later discourse in which they had been whitened. Ultimately, the sonic colour line has been somewhat confounded by the racial mobility of the Jewish body across the 20th century. For Winehouse, herself of Ashkenazi Jewish background, we might rethink the narrative here not simply as one of appropriating African American culture, musical culture, but also as the re-centralization of Jews in the idea of what African American musical culture means. So a racialized complexity is built into the very fabric of the sounds from which these post-millennial artists draw. And that complexity is further filtered through a British multiculturalism that also leaves an audible trace in this material. Specifically, moving on to part 2 of my argument, I want to draw attention to the significance of London as a cultural backdrop for this post-millennial nostalgia, as it plays an important role in answering Daphne Brooks's question, what kind of nostalgia is this? That is to say, however much their arrangements, production, or certain of their vocal strategies might point towards a transracial, transatlantic musical history, the grains of these women's voices point just as clearly towards a London origin that destabilizes their whiteness differently from how we might have thought. Across probably hundreds of references to Barthes' notion of the vocal grain in musicological literature across a range of subdisciplinary fields, an overwhelming number of them are made in passing, deploying some fairly non-specific definition that roughly equates to timbre, or perhaps individuality. But to identify an African American or a British grain, where grain is limited to timbre, would risk playing into old essentialisms about race and vocal sound. Such essentialisms have been far more usefully theorized in ways that shift the race-voice relationship away from sonic absolutes and towards the social construction and physical performance, as Nina Eichheim does, for example, when she writes of the choreographies of racialized vocality, or when she explicitly shifts the emphasis away from the sound of singing and towards the physical act of performing that sound. For Bart's part, though, he is quite clear that the grain of the voice is not, or is not merely, its timbre. And in fact, even when considering timbre, we would do well to remember Eychime's formulation of the choreographic nature thereof, rather than presuming any inherent stable, predestined sonic quality. One specific element of Bart's notion that presents itself as valuable here is the place of language. The idea of Britain and America being two nations divided by a common language is keenly at stake here. Language, or more particularly the relationship between music and language, is at the very centre of the grain as Bart describes it. The parenthetical emphasis here is part of Bart's attempt to focus analysis not on the linguistic content of song, but instead onto the voluptuousness of the language's sound signifiers, of its letters, where melody explores how the language works and identifies with that work. In one of the clearest moments of summary, Bart writes, "The grain is the materiality of the body speaking its mother tongue." Precisely how the body speaks that tongue is the question here, and so we find ourselves faced with issues of diction, a word Bart also emphasises, and accent. There are two contemporary accents that stand out in modern London speech: estuary English, named for the Thames estuary, and multicultural London English, henceforth EE and MLE respectively. Both have been characterised particularly in relation to the more traditional Cockney accent and to some extent received pronunciation, or RP. This is the classically well-spoken, so-called standard English pronunciation, associated primarily with class more than geography as such, notwithstanding the complex symbiosis between the two. So I'm going to spend a few moments explaining the relevant elements of these accents, in order then that we can try and hear the influence of them on the musical sounds under scrutiny. So one of the features that EE shares with Cockney is L dropping, that is, that the L often disappears into something approximating a W. So here milk becomes milk, drizzle becomes drizzle, and indeed the London rapper Lethal Bizzle becomes lethal bizzle. Another feature it shares with Cockney is the glottal stop. This may be the most audible sign of Cockney and indeed many other vernacular English accents. It's very prevalent in EE. Typically it occurs at the end of the word or before another consonant, so but becomes but and network becomes network. But where the following syllable is a weak vowel, EE is much less likely to glottalize than Cockney, so butter and water are likely to stay the same in EE, but become butter and water in Cockney. The rise of EE and the related decline in Cockney has been attributed to social mobility in ways connected to migration, not perhaps from outside the UK, but certainly within it. With higher rates of movement throughout the country, a lot of regional accents have been somewhat flattened out, as the intensity of local born and bred voices is diluted. MLE, meanwhile, is one of many urban dialects, not only in the UK but internationally, linked directly to ethnic diversity. And this table describes the ethnic diversity as self-reported by respondents to the 1991 UK census, and that is the first census that was taken in the UK after the birth of the artists that I'm exploring. The first three of these categories, Enfield, Hackney and Lambeth, represent the boroughs of London in which Winehouse, Adele and Paloma Faith were born and or raised, and you can see the diversity as compared with London as a whole, England as a whole and Great Britain as a whole. Such regional dialects like MLE are characterised by sounds and rhythms derived from multiple ethnolects, and they typically emerge within younger communities that consist of high levels of diversity in the ethnic makeup of their friendship groups. It's widely acknowledged that the presence of multiple ethnic groups in an area, such that multiple languages and ethnolects influence the acquisition of English as a first or second language, is a central factor in the emergence of MLE. There are various specific factors of MLE that set it apart from Cockney and EE, and others that align it with both. But for the present analysis, three features are particularly worth mentioning. The first of these is the tendency towards monophthongs, where Cockney and EE would tend towards diphthongs. So face in an RP voice becomes something like face in Cockney and face in MLE. Price similarly becomes price and price in MLE. While EE and Cockney are known for TH fronting, so TH becomes TH becomes an F in a word like think, it becomes fink. Then MLE displays a tendency, although not a strict one, of transforming the TH into a T or a D. So thing thus becomes ting, that might become dat. TH stopping, of course, is a linguistic feature not simply or necessarily accurately of black speech as such, but certainly of the white image of black speech. But in everyday London life, at least, TH stopping is a feature that extends into white British youth speech, and it does so not as a simple appropriation, but as a marker of linguistic blending resulting from localised ethnic diversity. The third feature distinctive of MLE is in its rhythmic delivery. So the basic spectrum on which timing works in speech is from stress-timed, where adjacent syllables have highly variable durations as part of the stress pattern of speech, to syllable-timed, where adjacent syllables have more equal durations. English is, on the whole, distinctly more stress-timed than many other languages. It's significantly more so than, for instance, Mandarin or Spanish. But a greater extent of syllable timing is a distinctive feature of MLE, in part due to the variety of linguistic influences. Moreover, this tendency is true regardless of the ethnic background of the speaker, suggesting that the development of syllable timing as a feature of this sociolect reflects the multicultural of its name. And here I have a clip of an interview between Dizzy Rascal and Jonathan Ross. Jonathan Ross is asking the questions, and he has a more estery English voice, so it's interesting to compare that rhythm with the rhythm of Dizzy Rascal as an interviewee.
Reference points, because a lot of people, they try to be American, and obviously it's kind of where the big money is in your music, really, isn't it? That's the biggest market.
Yeah. And that's what I actually got from the Americans. I got a sense of where they were from. So I wanted to incorporate that same thing about where I'm from, London, UK. And,
yeah.
I mean,
they talk about, there's a pride about where they're coming from, and they draw from there. But I guess if you're making, because I know in some of your songs you reference things like, you know, parts of London, you reference Coronation Street in one of your songs, stuff like that, and an American audience isn't going to have a clue what that is. So presumably you're not worried about all the reference points.
No, because same way that if I'm interested in something they're saying, I have to research it, they should do the same, personally. That's how I feel.
They should, but they're lazier than we are, traditionally, I believe.
Yeah, that's just the way it is there, man. They'll catch up.
Yeah.
So hopefully you can hear all of the tendency towards the monophthong as well as the TH fronting, TH stopping there in Dizzy Rascal's voice, and also this distinctive rhythmic delivery. Adele and Winehouse can both be heard speaking with an EE accent, not an MLE one, but there are audible markers of both in their song, and so this is where I'm moving now to some specific musical references. First example I want to demonstrate with is Best for Last by Adele. And here we can sense a hint of the TH stopping. We can also hear this generic Southern English long A in the word last, so it becomes last, which is distinctly Southern, as opposed to last, which is a Northern English pronunciation, and neither one of them comes across as the American pronunciation of the word last that we might expect if Adele were really strongly referencing the American sound here. So we have the TH stopping in da and right, the right things, and some generic Southern British English sounds as well.
And I'm all you need, and that you never want more. Then you say all of the right things without a clue, but you'd say the best for last, like I'm the one for you.
So also from Adele is the example Tired, and here we can hear quite a strong tendency now towards the monophthongal sound that's quite characteristic of MLE, and we can hear that in this assonance. On my eyes you were smiling becomes much more monophthongal in this particular example.
I'm between the middle watching hastiness unfold. On my eyes you were smiling in the spotlight, dancing with the night when I fell off your mind.
As a third Adele Adele example, we can look to Hometown Glory, which indeed is about her hometown of London, and we hear the monophthongal tendency of MLE, the glottal stopping of both EE and MLE, and actually the insistence in the word city of keeping the T that's quite characteristic of estuary English.
How the wonders of this world are the wonders of now. I like it in the city when the air is so thick and opaque.
So it's far harder to hear any kind of London accent in Winehouse's work, and on the contrary, there are many more markers of a generic American diction, although there are some glimpses here and there. We find that, for instance, in Some Unholy War, where we can hear very distinctly the TH fronting in the words with and strength.
Shook off beside him with strength he didn't know. It's you I'm fighting for.
But there is another intriguing vocal strategy that Winehouse uses, which I want to suggest situates her vocal choreography in a multicultural London context, and it's a gesture that I want to call glottal ornamentation. So I'm working on tracing the origins of this, and there's something of an argument to be made that we can find traces of it in the Ronettes' Be My Baby or on Lauryn Hill's MTV Unplugged album from 2002. But this particular strategy rose to a special prominence in post-millennial London, and its rhythmic features, I propose, are those of MLE, whatever the longer provenance of the sound. Describing the glottal ornament has rarely proved successful. I don't generally manage to get the idea across very well, but the closest I've got is to say, imagine an ornament, maybe a melisma, and now imagine it pixelated. So that's what you're listening out for, this pixelated ornamentation. The important features for my purposes are, number one, that the sonic stoppage resembles the glottal stop so characteristic of London accents, and more importantly, number two, that its vocal rhythm points towards the syllable times delivery of MLE. So I want to situate this idea of glottal ornamentation in relation actually to an artist who's not really picked up on in this particular genre, and that's Kate Nash. The special relevance of Kate Nash, though, is that she was at the Brit School with Adele in the early part of the century, and so there's this suggestion of them feeding off each other in a certain musical environment. So let's just listen to this particular rhythmic delivery, which I think is influenced by a kind of MLE syllable timing. So you can't really hear any ornamentation in there, but I think we can hear the traces of the same type of rhythmic delivery in the ornamentation in Winehouse's Some Unholy War.
Some unholy war. Yeah, my man was fighting.
Some initial work has been undertaken on the influence of MLE speech timing on melodic rhythm, but noticeably it has only considered MLE speakers, whereas Winehouse was an EE speaker. And I haven't yet managed to undertake the extraordinarily detailed computational analysis required to prove or disprove the suggestion here. But in any case, I remain convinced of the point nonetheless that the glottal ornament has about it something of the staccato rhythm in terms of the spoken delivery of MLE. So I just want to move on now to a kind of coda here, and to suggest that we can read these strategies, these vocal strategies, as moments of materiality of the voice engaging its mother tongue, and as casting a new light on what we might have thought the racial politics of nostalgia were in the early years of the millennium. As much as these voices do point, as Brooks suggests, to civil rights era American music, raising all kinds of spectres of appropriation, they also speak to the Englishness of their vocal grains. And in this way, they don't just link up across this genre, within this nostalgic musical family tree, but also across different genres by way of their Londonness. Specifically, I think it's worth concluding by briefly opening up in another direction, by way of another very specifically London character, namely Lily Allen, whose debut album All Right Still was released the same year as Winehouse's Back to Black, 2006. Actually quite well spoken in speech, Allen is notorious for an incredibly affected vernacular London sound in her song, tending strongly towards the estuary and Cockney sound signifiers. Although Allen drew musically and visually on various signifiers of nostalgic popular culture, she was not linked to Adele, Winehouse or Paloma Faith, because the genealogy she constructed was a rather different one. In Allen, we find signifiers of black British culture as a contrasting narrative of multiculturalism from the American roots that provide the central touchstone in the discourse around Adele and others. So one example of that can be found in LDN, where we hear a kind of Notting Hill Carnival sound that points to a Windrush generation of Caribbean immigration to Britain.
Riding through the city on my bike all day, cause the filth took away my license. It doesn't get me down and I feel okay, cause the sights that I'm seeing are priceless.
Another example would be found on the song Smile, where we hear a two-tone genre fusing ska with punk rock, and in fact the name of the genre two-tone is derived from the label Two Tone Records, which was established in the late 1970s precisely as an attempt to defuse racial tension in Thatcherite Britain. We also find a nostalgia on the album for a distinctly white, swinging 60s kind of London, the great golden age of British cool that had formed a backdrop already for Britpop in the 1990s, as a kind of nostalgic cool that all of our artists would have experienced as young teenagers. We can find an example of this on Everything's Just Wonderful. So the links to be made here are not along the lines of African-American girl groups, but to the likes of Twiggy, Petula Clark, Cilla Black, and indeed Emma Bunton, formerly of the Spice Girls, who was part of this nostalgic wave with her own album Life in Mono, also from 2006. For her part, Amy Winehouse also tapped into the Thatcherite British sounds of ska and two-tone, not only with Just Friends from the Back to Black album, but with a number of covers of songs by two-tone bands like the Specials, which were released as part of the deluxe edition of the album. One such example would be Monkey Man. By no means do I want to downplay the extent to which an African-American musical genealogy can be found in these artists' work, but I do want to insist that the British multicultural context be traced also, and I think that a close exploration of vocal grain invites us to do precisely that.